and welcome back to Vinyl Friday, the Revolver Odyssey. Technically, we have actually finished the Revolver album, track by track journey thing, but a good many of you requested that I cover the singles as well, which I thought was a great idea. So this episode of Revolver Odyssey, and its partner episode, which will come out in about 2 weeks, will serve as a sort of coda to the rest of the Revolver Odyssey series. So thank you to those of you who requested that I cover these singles. I'm really looking forward to this. By the time today's song was released, Beatles fans had to wait approximately 6 months for a new song, which was about as long as they had ever had to wait. The previous single that had been released was a double A-side, We Can Work It Out / Day Tripper, or Day Tripper / We Can Work It Out, depending on your preference. So the Beatles were under some pressure from MkII to pump out some more music. Because, you know, it's not like musicians are artists or anything, they are robots who exist to produce capital. So under this pressure, the Beatles had to produce a new single, and because it was the Beatles, they were able to do this in the midst of producing one of the greatest albums of last century. Of course. They recorded today's song pretty early in the Revolver sessions, actually on the same day as they were working on Love You To. The song is Paperback Writer, and it sounds like this.
Paperback Writer.
We're very fortunate because the photographer Leslie Bryce was in the studio on the day that the Beatles were working on this song. So there will be some photos that will accompany this episode of the Beatles as they are working the very moments that they were recording this song. Cool. This song was written by Paul on the way to his BFF John's house, where they were going to have a songwriting session. Storytime Correspondent, tell us the tale. Good day, Vinyl Friday friends. We will be taking today's first reading from The Good Book. I remember showing up at his house with the idea for Paperback Writer. Because I had a long drive to get there, I would often start thinking away and writing on my way out, and I developed the whole idea in the car. I came in, had a bowl of cornflakes, and said, "How's about if we write a letter? Dear sir or madam, next line, next paragraph, etc." I wrote it all out, and John said, "Yeah, that's good." It just flowed. The impetus behind this song is a conversation that Paul had had with his aunt, where she'd accused him of only writing love songs. My auntie said to me, "Why do you always write songs about love all the time? Can't you ever write about a horse or the Summit Conference or something interesting?" Yeah, Aunt Millie, I'm sure a song about the Summit Conference would be positively riveting. I think the song is great. Unfortunately, that view isn't necessarily shared with many of the critics at the point of the song's release. So in a way, it's almost as though this song ushered in a series of events in 1966 that made it kind of a year for our poor beleaguered Beatles. So first we're going to explore why I think the song is so damn wonderful, and then we're going to look into some of those events that came to define the Beatles' 1966 and probably determine the course of their career from that point forward. I would like, if you don't mind, to start at the beginning with those otherworldly Beatle harmonies. Here we go.
Paperback Writer.
They're incredibly multi-layered. From what I can tell, there are 5 individual vocal parts, and I believe they're all double-tracked. So it's just a wall of vocal coming at you from the top of the song. Excellent way to start a song. No musical accompaniment, totally a cappella, just Beatle voices. That sounds like a good time to me. As some of you know, my Beatles cover band, the Elementary Penguins, has been recently reinstated. Some of them watch this show. Hello, bandmates. And this song, more specifically the introduction to this song, continues to be a thorn in our sides. From what I can tell, here are all the different harmony parts.
Paperback Writer.
All of those individual parts are double-tracked, which gives it a thicker, fuller sound. It's a lovely effect what they're doing vocally in this song, because the first 2 come in harmony, and they hold their note. And then the second 2 come in here, and they hold their note. And then the last one comes in on top and holds that top note. So that by the end, there's this beautiful cluster of suspended notes just hanging in the air there. It's messy, but in a celestial way. There's nothing ordinary about the style. The voices sound different. I especially like the answering voices they use one against the other. How would the Times critic describe it? Polyphonic! George Martin says that this had never been done before, but George Harrison commented that this song was kind of Beach Boys-esque.
We were trying to compete with the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds and all that. I think it was around that time. When was Pet Sounds? Our voices were really like double track. Paperback Writer.
Paperback. Yeah, that's where it goes, yeah.
Couple of other points about the vocals. The first is that Paul really liked the phrase paperback writer for its rhythmic potential. I think he really capitalizes on that potential because he speaks that phrase in a very percussive way. Like, listen here. Paperback writer. See, it's like he's really using those P's to great advantage. Paperback writer. The words become a rhythmic instrument. I really love how he growls on the R sound as he's singing the final paperback writer. It's like a nice little Row! Writer! I like that too. That high harmony that runs through the last couple of verses is actually George and John singing Frère Jacques. Yes, the nursery rhyme song. Listen.
You must pretend that you can save me, but I need a break and I wanna be.
This is something I learned 2 days ago. Even Spotify knows it. Look.
Really like it, you can have the rights. Could make a million for you overnight.
There's also this cool effect that they're employing at the end of the chorus. It's like a tape delay thing, an echo. It sounds like this. Did you catch it right there at the end? Paperback writer. I don't think they had done that before. It sounds great. Of this released single, the B-side Rain is usually the one that is pointed to as an exemplar of the Beatles' increasing experimentation in the studio, but you can definitely hear it on this track as well. It's just a lot more subtle. Let's move on to the guitar riff, because arguably that's an even bigger part of the song than that vocal intro. From what I can tell, the guitar part was played by Paul on his Epiphone Casino, which was a guitar that he dearly loved, and doubled by George Harrison. So dual leads, but playing in unison. During this period in the Beatles' career, there seems to be a sort of running theme in their riff styles. So you can hear that there are similarities in the riff between Paperback Writer and Got to Get You Into My Life. And also, I Want to Tell You. On to the bass. The bass used on this track is Paul's Rickenbacker 4001S, which is a bass that I loved and coveted as a teenager. I thought it was the pinnacle of the bass guitar. And then I tried one, and I realized that the body was humongous on me, and actually I wouldn't want one at all. I would find it kind of unwieldy and uncomfortable to play. But it looks great on Paul McCartney. It was given as a gift by Rickenbacker, who had been doing mightily well out of their single guitar gifts that they had been giving to the Beatles, and in fact deeply influenced the sound of the band, not once but twice, the first time obviously being when they gifted George Harrison a 12-string. We're getting so sidetracked, but this is cool and interesting to me, so I'm gonna pursue it. George ended up using that 12-string guitar from that iconic opening chord on A Hard Day's Night straight through to Rubber Soul. And in doing so, sort of invented the subgenre of folk rock. Certainly invented the Byrds. And then again here with Paul's bass guitar, when they gave it to him, he realized it had a much more powerful sound than his Hofner, and began using that in the studio, although I think he continued to use the Hofner while performing, which makes sense because it was a hollow-bodied bass and therefore lighter. Before we get too stuck in the weeds, a powerful bass alone is not enough to produce a huge sound on a recording. We can attribute that to one Jeff Emmerich. Why not use a big EMI loudspeaker as a microphone and feed it backwards? This method was based on the premise that because a loudspeaker works by converting electrical signals into vibrations, it could be made to do the reverse and convert sound waves into electrical signals, just as a microphone does. The speaker we used was one of the big white ones we used to call white elephants, Ken recalled. We positioned it directly in front of the bass speaker, and the moving diaphragm of the second speaker made the electric current. I just fed it straight out into the microphone input of the mixing console. We'll get the bass correspondent in to play some of my favorite moments on this track. Start with that little flutter that he does right before going into the verse, if you please. Oh, and what about the way that the verse is syncopated? And then he takes that to a whole new level on the last verse. Thank you, bass correspondent. We're going to move on to the percussion on this track. Again, because of Jeff Emmerich's incredible, youthful innovation, the drums on this track also sound enormous, and if you would like to hear me ramble about that, you can listen to it in the Tomorrow Never Knows episode, which you can find here. Here's the thing that I love about the percussion on this track. There's this like little rattle of tambourine at the end of every line. Here's one I prepared earlier. Let's give this a go. How did they do that? It sounds like it's... I think I can do this. Let's try again. Ah! It is remarkably difficult to get the tambourine to stop making noise on time. And I don't think they're doing like a... It sounds too self-contained. I think it's tambourine. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's hi-hat. Maybe I should have Googled this before I started recording. I'll Google it now. Personnel. Ba, 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 ba. Oh, damn. That's John Lennon on tambourine. Well done, John. If you can do it, I can do it. I'm going to try one more time. I think that's how he's doing it. I think. In any case, it sounds very tight and very tidy, and it helps to move the song along. I really like that about this song. That's enough on the tambourine. What's next? Oh, the snare hit right before the riff comes in. Maybe it's just a cue for when the riff needs to come in terms of the timing, but either way, it's really cool. Very snappy. Really draws your focus right before that riff slaps you across the face, like this. Did you catch it? Again. And that, especially given the extra power that the drums now have, sounds great. And then you've got the ending, which, like Good Day Sunshine and She Said, is a dedicated separate section of the song that fades out. Here. And of course, the lyrics are cute. They are potentially based on a Daily Mail piece about aspiring author Martin Amis, who would have been a teenager at the time. And one of my favorite details about the lyrics of this song is that the protagonist wants to be a paperback writer. And the protagonist's son also wants to be a paperback writer. Good for him. The last thing I'd like to point out about the lyrics is that 1,000 pages, give or take a few, is probably too many for your debut novel. I mean, who are you supposed to be, Patrick Rothfuss? Given all of this, you would expect this song to be an instant hit, but unlike the previous 7 singles that the Beatles released, this one didn't debut at number 1. It took a week to get there. It had to displace Frank Sinatra's Strangers in the Night first.
Strangers in the night.
Paperback Writer as a single had the lowest sales in the UK since Love Me Do in 1962. And though there were some contemporary positive reviews, NME critics, I've forgotten their names, hang on, Roy Carr and Tony Tyler, writing in Beatles and Illustrated Record, postulate that the song was a little bit too clever for listeners of that time, and point to the fact that a lot of the criticisms of the song are to do with the triviality of the lyrics, which I find to be a confusing point. Is it too clever or is it too trivial? Make up your mind, British critics. I mean, their fans wrote into the Record Mirror to complain that the band had become too aloof, perhaps because of the accompanying promotional video that came out with the song. And then there was the cover. The Beatles elected to use the same photo that they had used for the cover of the US Capitol release Yesterday and Today, the infamous Butcher cover. According to John Lennon, they were motivated by boredom and resentment at having to do another photo session, another Beatles thing. So along comes photographer Robert Whittaker, and he's like, hey guys, let's do something kind of dark, something avant-garde. And the Beatles, in response, were like, we have a dark sense of humor, and we're beginning to get into the avant-garde, you could say. We dabble in highbrow culture now. And this is what the end result was. Paul in particular really pushed for the use of this photograph for the cover of Yesterday and Today. He said it was the Beatles' commentary on the war in Vietnam. Predictably, it didn't go down well in the States, and they ended up replacing it with this picture, which the Beatles were not really that fond of. But as we covered earlier, their job as artists was to generate capital for the companies that owned them. It didn't go down all that well in the UK either. One critic, upon seeing it, lamented the importation of American sick humor to the shores of the United Kingdom. Controversy, the Beatles, 1966. I'm sure that's the last we'll hear of it. So Beatles release Revolver in early August of 1966 and immediately embark on a world tour. When they arrive in Japan, there are student riots going on, but on top of that there are demonstrations against the Beatles themselves because they're due to perform at the Budokan, which was a place of spiritual significance that was usually reserved for martial arts demonstrations. The Beatles were blissfully unaware of this, so they had no idea that they were entering a country in which there were a whole lot of people who were really pissed off at them. Another thing that took them by surprise was how quiet the audience was. You have to remember that for the last 3 years, the Beatles have been performing to crowds that are roaring at them. They couldn't hear themselves. They could lose their voices and not actually be able to sing, and no one would be able to tell the difference.
We might have been waxworks for half the good we did there. You know, nobody heard anything.
So they get up on the first night to perform their concert at the Budokan and find that they sound horribly out of tune. They were horrified by it. They were embarrassed.
Get to the point where it was particularly bad, and then we'd kind of do our Elvis legs and wave to the crowd, and they'd all scream, and then it'd cover that.
You know, that scream used to cover a multitude of sins, right? And now, at those shows, it wasn't there.
I've had a listen to this performance, and I really don't think it's as bad as they thought they were.
Paperback
But I do know that it was important to them. Like, Ringo has stated that the only reason he joined the band in the first place was that they were the best playing band in Liverpool at the time. So for them to get up on stage and sound like crap, it just wasn't what any of them wanted. They had higher standards than that. After Japan, they went to the Philippines and they had a marvelous time. I'm kidding. It was nightmarish.
I hated the Philippines.
They inadvertently snubbed Imelda Marcos, the wife of a dictator. She had invited them to the presidential palace, I believe, for breakfast, and it was going to be their day off, so they were asked about it. They were like, no thanks, we'd actually really like to just stay at the hotel and recuperate.
It is indeed a great honour, but it's our day off, so we can't go. And we're very firm about that because we don't get many days off. We're not stuffing in some sort of royal reception, you know.
And somewhere between the Beatles and the president, that message got lost in translation. People showed up at their rooms saying, come on, we have to go, we're going to the presidential palace. And they said, no, thank you, it's our day off. We said no. They turned on the television.
There was this horrific TV show of Madame Marcus screaming, you know, they've let me down.
The Beatles have let me down! And there are children crying, and the people are furious. They had no idea that they'd stirred up this situation. They thought they were just taking a day off. And from that point, they could barely get anyone to serve them food to their hotel room. When food was served to them, it was often rancid. They couldn't get a car to the airport.
And we got downstairs like one motorbike. You know, after this huge motorcade brought us in, there was just this one guy.
The people in the streets were jeering at them and shouting at them and shoving them and literally spitting on them.
Did you get kicked? No, I was very delicate and moved every time they touched me.
They had to hide behind some nuns to stop from being assaulted by the crowd.
You know, when there's the famous story of John and I hiding behind these nuns because we thought it's a Catholic country, they won't beat up the nuns.
And they finally get on the plane, and then Mal Evans and Brian Epstein are dragged back off.
And Mal, who was the nicest, gentlest person, and he breaking out in tears, and he turned to me and he said, tell Lil I love her. That's his wife.
Surely that's the last of it, right? Wrong! In around March of 1966, each of the Beatles had given a separate interview to the journalist and friend, Maureen Cleave. And as a small part of that, John Lennon was commenting on the relevance of Christianity to the youth of 1966. It was published in the UK in March to no particularly great response. Unfortunately, some of the quotes about Jesus were taken a little bit out of context and resurfaced in the United States right before the American leg of the tour was due to begin, and it blew up. To give you some of that context, here's the full quote. "We're more popular than Jesus now. I don't know which will go first, rock and roll or Christianity. Jesus was alright, but his disciples were thick and ordinary. It's them twisting it that ruins it for me." Whether or not he was right is beside the point, because what was taken away from it in the United States was that he was boasting about how much better than Jesus the Beatles were. Boy, did that get people's knickers in a bundle. There were record burnings staged throughout the South. The Beatles received death threats during the tour, including from the KKK.
The Klan is going to come out here because we're the only organization that will come out and make a stop to these accusations. This is nothing but blasphemy. Yes.
What ways and means?
Well, I don't want to say this, but there'll be a lot of surprises Monday night, I believe, when they get here.
Who ordinarily are such nice guys. And in case it's not plainly obvious, I'm kidding. At one of their performances in Memphis, a firecracker went off, and immediately all of the Beatles checked to see which of them had been shot. Ringo started performing with his cymbals angled a little bit further up, just to serve as a little bit of protection from the audience.
I mean, it wasn't long since President Kennedy had been assassinated, and I remember going to one of their concerts at the Red Rocks Stadium, and the amphitheatre of the Red Rocks is such that you could have a sniper on the hill, could pick off any of those fellows at any time, no problem. And I was very aware of this, and so was Brian, and so were the boys.
I didn't want to talk because I thought they'd kill me, because they take things so seriously here. I mean, they shoot you, and then they realize that it wasn't that important. I find this point that John Lennon is making here eerily prophetic, because the asshole who ended up shooting him dead cited the original, more popular than Jesus quote as influencing his decision to murder John Lennon. So it goes. Eventually, John Lennon was made to issue an official statement of apology. He had to give a press conference in which he begged everyone's forgiveness and tried to explain himself better. And
but I'm not saying that we're better or greater or comparing us with Jesus Christ as a person or God as a thing or whatever it is. I just said what I said and it was wrong or was taken wrong, and now it's all this.
I found this photo on Reddit last week, and it makes me so sad. This is John Lennon immediately after making that public apology. He just looks so drained. Can you imagine spending 3 months in the studio making some of the most interesting and hard-hitting music of your career, and then re-emerging into the real world and tripping immediately into this mess? Ugh. Not only that, they were playing the same venues that they'd already played. The audiences were a little bit smaller this time around.
They're less popular than they were months ago.
Really? I bet there's another group you like better now than the Beatles. Is there?
There is.
Which one?
Herman and the Hermits.
They were bored. This was boring. And as a musician, I can tell you that it's so much more interesting and fulfilling to perform the new material than it is to perform things that you wrote when you were essentially a different person. And the same was true of the Beatles at this point in their career. They were still performing songs from 1963 and 1964. And they weren't those people anymore. So I imagine it would have felt less authentic, less genuine. It would have maybe felt like they were pretending to be a band that they no longer were. Paperback Writer ended up being the last new song that the Beatles would ever debut on a tour. And it was nearly impossible for them to execute live, for reasons I mentioned earlier. All of these events coalesced and ended up being the final nails in the coffin. This is George speaking. When we got to Candlestick Park, we placed our cameras on the amplifiers and put them on the timer. We stopped between tunes, Ringo got down off the drums, and we stood facing the amplifiers with our back to the audience and took photographs. We knew this is it, we're not going to do this again. This is our last concert. It was a unanimous decision. And when they walked off the stage at Candlestick Park in late August of 1966, the touring phase of the Beatles' career ended. Sometime in 1966, George was asked about the decline in singles sales, and he had this to say. Well, this keeps coming up. It's virtually impossible to answer. We just know we are making better records. The fact that they sell a lot isn't enough anymore. We're interested in getting better sounds. Paul adds to that in the same year. We always wanted to do something different. These two quotes are very future-facing for the Beatles. The Beatles thrived on novelty, and touring was the same old. And maybe that last miserable tour highlighted for them the creative joy that they'd been able to experience when they had worked in the studio earlier in the year. So after that tour finished, they took a break. They re-entered the studio in late 1966, and they emerged with a single, again another double A-side, Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane. And there exist videos of the Beatles going back into the studio in winter of 1966. I really enjoy these videos because they look so excited. They're so fired up to get back in there and get back to work and do something new.
Do you think that in the new year that you're going to be going your own ways instead of being a group? No.
And with this new single, they took everything that they had started with Revolver and they polished it and they embellished it and they made it bigger. It's like they had to suffer through everything that 1966 had to throw at them in order to produce their 1967 masterpiece, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. That's it from me. If you enjoyed this episode or you would like to support any of the weird things I do, I will leave a link in the description to my Buy Me a Coffee page where you are most welcome to make a donation, but no pressure, friends. Thank you so much to everybody who has made a donation or signed up as a member. I very much appreciate you. If you're curious about what any of my original music sounds like, I will leave a link in the description for that as well. Otherwise, thanks for hanging out with me. I'll see you here next week. Have a great weekend! She's just having the best bath of her life, aren't you, girl? My head's not in the frame. We're very fortunate because photographer Leslie Bryce, not Bruce, Bryce, photographer Lenny, Paperback Writer, right? Nope, hang on. A real thorn in our sides. Let me just double check that idiom because as the child of a non-native English speaker, I tend to really mix up my idioms. Thorn inside. Okay. Shit, man, I'm still on page 1. Strangers in the night. Beatles in Illustrated History. Is that right? Nope. Exchanging glances, wandering in the night. Make up your mind, British critics. British critics, British critics. It rolls off the tongue quite nicely. I'm not even doing that song.
Exchanging glances